and welcome to Tiny Changes Big Podcast. I'm your host, B. Charlotte. This podcast is all about bringing you real talk and insights from the music industry, with conversations from those who actively live it. We will cover less discussed topics like finance, identity, public perception, and how attempting to survive this unregulated industry impacts our mental health. Together, we'll explore the rhythms of mental health, the highs, the lows, and the steady heartbeat in between, because your well-being is the foundation of your creativity. So come on in, everyone's welcome. Today, we're diving into the risks of the music industry, its lack of regulation, and most importantly, what we can actually do about it. This is a two-part episode where we are tackling some big topics from the artist and industry perspective. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. George Musgrave, an academic, an author and an artist.
Before we jump in, a note on our content. This podcast will discuss and explore some difficult subject areas. We want to make sure you're aware of what's coming ahead, so you can decide if you're in a good place to listen and make a healthy decision on how and if you want to consume this podcast content. This episode begins and includes discussions of suicide rates in the industry, anxiety, depression, burnout, the pressures of social media, and financial insecurity. It references unsafe working conditions in the music industry, including an abuse of power and sexual harassment. We want to encourage you to think about how you look after yourself during and after the episode, and listener discretion is advised. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host and are intended for informational purposes only. They do not constitute professional mental health, legal, or financial advice. So now you know what's ahead. We hope you join us and enjoy this episode.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for having me.
How are we feeling today, George? Are you all right?
Yeah, all good, thank you. All good.
Good. Buzzing. Really looking forward to having this conversation with you today. As I just mentioned, this is a big topic. There's a lot to get into, a lot to discuss, to share, and hopefully we're going to help as many young people out there as possible. So, with that in mind, let's dive right in. I know from your research that you've extensively covered the links between the music industry and mental health, and as your research cites, the music industry is one of the most dangerous industries to work in because of the mental health implications. We do really often, and unfortunately, hear lots of stories of negative experiences for a lot of musicians, and in particular our young people. But on the flip side, we do know firsthand as well just how much music can be such a real release for so many artists, particularly through the creativity and the performance. Myself included, I have absolutely no idea what I would do if I did not write songs and get things out of my head, things going on into a song and release it in that way. So these are the real extremes we have between the positives, the negatives in terms of mental health. But I'd like to ask you, what does the research say about what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, the research that I've been doing for the last, say, like 10 or 15 years very much captures this paradox or this like mutual coexistence that you've just fleshed out, right? Which is this notion that a music career, as you know, as I know, as lots of the people listening to this know, like there's lots of amazing, wonderful things that come from that. Like in a way, you almost like don't need another person that comes along and tells you all of the wonderful things that come from being a musician. Like the times that I can remember in my life of like my friends ringing me up like while I was being played on Radio 1 and like screaming down the phone, or like performing on stage at like Reading and Leeds and Wireless and Radio 1's Big Weekend, or I remember being on the Radio 1's breakfast show with like Nick Grimshaw, and like it was like me and Taylor Swift announcing like, you know, Radio 1's Big Week, like amazing things, like things that I look back on, yeah, that are just amazing vibes, right? That I remember so fondly, working with Mike Skinner of The Streets or working with Ed Sheeran. Like, you know, there's a lot that's amazing about a music career. But the research that I've done is tried to explore how can it be the case that something that brings the people that make it so much joy and camaraderie and friendship and all of that stuff can at the same time be the occupation which, for example, and this is much of this conversation is upsetting, just to clarify in advance, these are not easy statistics and easy conversations to have, but the occupational category, for example, that is called musicians, actors, and entertainers, that has the 4th highest suicide rate in the United Kingdom, according to data that's published from the Office for National Statistics. And for example, women that work in those occupations, their suicide rate compared to women in the general population is 69% higher. For men is 20% higher. In the United States, a slightly broader occupational category, which includes other kinds of creative and cultural workers, has the highest female suicide rate of every occupation in the United States for several years, 2012, 2015, 2021. This is profoundly serious. And the rates of anxiety and depression and burnout that has been seen in the research that I and others have done is extremely high, significantly higher than the general public. And so unraveling and trying to understand that paradox of how something so joyful can be a space for many also of suffering, actually, is something I think people find very difficult. And I also think that conversation sometimes is, of course, it's difficult to have a conversation like that. But what's also difficult is that the music industry is an industry and a climate of being positive, right? You have to always be positive all the time. You have to be thankful to be here and pleased to not be being paid and grateful for the opportunity, and everything's wonderful. You live in a kind of social media post of everything being wonderful. And so actually people sometimes get a bit unsettled when someone comes along and says, this isn't all wonderful. Much of it is wonderful, but much of it isn't. And that reality check, I think, is difficult for people.
Oh, totally. And I guess as well, like as I was saying there, we put it into our music, and for a lot of us, that's how we deal with it. But then, as I discovered myself, that's often not enough. So these experiences, these feelings, these struggles, you put it into a song, and for a long time I thought, well, that's me dealing with it. Brilliant, great. I sing it on stage, I maybe get a bit emotional, I feel a bit emotional, or whatever, I'm dealing with it, and then yeah, quite sometimes for some people, myself included, you kind of get to a moment where you realise, no, this needs more than just the cure of creativity. Unfortunately, if it could cure everything, then that would be fantastic. But like you're saying, it's so much wider and so much more serious than that as well. And I think that like what you're saying, it's everything is supposed to be shiny and happy and pretty and great. And I think myself as well, when I was signed to a major label, there was highs, there was lows, there was good times, there was difficult times, and there's a lot that I gained from it, but also it wasn't what I expected. It didn't live up to this, I guess, dream I maybe had in my head. And at that time, I felt like I couldn't say that to anybody. I didn't want to say that to other artists, because that's admitting that, I don't know, I'm failing, I'm rubbish, I'm not good enough for this opportunity or something. You don't obviously want to relay that to people around you, because, well, you should be grateful, you've had this, like what you're saying. And I think it can, that's, I guess, what pushes a lot of us insular then, and you kind of deal with it as you go along.
A lot of it as well is like one of the things I hope to try and do, like through the research that I've been doing, and like that lots of other people are doing, right? It's not just me doing it, is to like normalize a conversation around feeling some of these things. Because like a lot of musical careers and the way that people live and represent their musical careers are like Instagram post highlights of what people imagine that this thing looks like. And for many, many people, one of the things that you see empirically, for example, in surveys that I've done where you would take clinical measures of anxiety and depression using like validated screening tools, and then you will look at the things that like predict health and well-being outcomes. One of the things that you see that comes through quite often is whether or not people feel that they're successful or not. So the people that answer either no or don't know to that question, for example, have way worse well-being scores than people that say yes. Now, arguably, this is true amongst people that don't make music as well. But the challenge, if you're comparing a musical career to, I don't know, being a fire person or a teacher or a university lecturer or like whatever, any kind of standard labor market, I suppose, is many of the barometers of success are like relatively straightforward for you to gauge, insofar as like there's a hierarchy of positions within your company, there's a pay that you're earning. If you work as a teacher, for example, your pay is nationally negotiated, and you're looking to achieve certain things within your life. What's really interesting for like musicians is you can be at a level that many other people think is really very, very successful, but you still live at home with your mum. So there's a really heavy disjuncture. So, one of the interviews, there was a book that I co-published with Sally Ann Gross in 2020, and it's called Can Music Make You Sick? And it's based on a very, very the biggest survey in the world on this topic, plus interviews with musicians, with clinicians, with music managers, with a whole range of people. And it's really interesting there when you get people to talk about what success is to them. Because one of the people we interviewed was like currently number one in several countries. When we spoke to him, he's like one of the biggest people in dance music. For like he's a serious guy. And we asked him, like, how do you feel successful? How successful do you feel? And he's like, well, yeah, I'm number one in quite a few countries, and I've just come back from Las Vegas. I mean, that was amazing, like performing in Las Vegas. And he was like, but I mean, look around, look where you're interviewing me. I'm still in my childhood bedroom. I don't earn enough money to move out of home. And if you tell lots of people that, they will struggle to understand what that means and what that looks like, because the music industry is a mythologizing game. Like, it's a storytelling game. Like, people write stories in their songs and they share those stories, but the idea of the story like ripples throughout music around what people think it really is. And part of the research that I do, that lots of other people do, is trying to peel back the layer of how it's like represented to look at what it really looks like on the ground. And I think many people struggle to come to terms with the disjuncture of how it really meaningfully looks like on the ground. And that impact is in lots of different ways. Some of my, like, recently I've been very interested in the economic focus of not recently, for a long time I've been interested in the economic focus of what that looks like, how you can build and sustain a life. I know Katie has experience, for example, in different sides of the music industry in terms of regulation and power imbalances and abuse and various things like that. There's lots of different ways of thinking about what the reality actually looks like. But the point is that there's a huge disjuncture between the myth that people see and the reality on the ground. And actually, I think people being aware of that and knowing that, I hope, is quite helpful. Because if you just looked around on Instagram, you would constantly feel inferior and feel that you weren't being very successful. But many of those things that you see on there mask the fact that the cars that you see are all leased on finance, the people still live at home with their mums, everybody's piecing together some kind of arrangement. Much of it's not real,
Exactly. And yeah, a lot of it is really, really fake. And I think as well, like, in terms of when we're talking about an unregulated industry, the finance side of it, the earning a living side of it is such a huge part. Like, it's hard to sometimes justify and say, yes, I'm a professional musician, or this is my job, when you don't know what you're earning month to month, and that even could be somebody at a really significant level. And I think nowadays, especially as well, with obviously social media platforms, and in particular TikTok, it's like a whole different stratosphere now, a whole different level, where somebody one day can make a TikTok and the next day an A&R's phoning them up and they're signed based off of one TikTok cover they've done, for example, and that kickstarts their career, and that's a whole different thing. And again, I guess that's slightly going off topic there, but kind of introducing the record labels side of it, in terms of when you're doing your research, and in particular the large amount of research that went into the book that you mentioned as well, is talking to artists and the creative side of it, but is there also talking to record labels and talking to the industry side of it? Like, I'd be really curious, what's their perspective, what's their take on the points you're trying to put across?
Yeah, there's a few things I would say there. I'll do in two parts of the answers. I mean, the first part that you're talking about this notion that like people can like blow up overnight on TikTok and then suddenly an A&R calls them. It's a very, I mean, I've just finished a research project that's on social media and well-being among musicians. It's this like profoundly alienating sense where this like anthropomorphized figure of an algorithm like looms over your life and makes these decisions based on kind of seeming randomness. And like music careers are well understood as being founded on a kind of randomness. I mean, I published a paper last year that's called The Dark Side of Optimism, which makes this analogy that in many ways a music career shares a lot of similarities with gambling, because the level of risk is actually incredibly high in terms of whether or not you'll actually turn this into a sustainable living. And I always use these statistics, but I don't actually use them to be bleak. I actually use them so that when people hear them, I hope it actually makes them feel better. So I will share these numbers with you. This is just to contextualize so that you can place your experiences as a musician in the context of other people's experiences. So the most robust data that we have on musicians' earnings comes from the Intellectual Property Office. And that tells you that 37% of musicians earn less than £5,000 from music in the year 2019. So, and that figure then is 47% of musicians earn less than £10,000. So if you think that minimum wage, if you got a job tomorrow and got paid and did a job that was the lowest you could be paid by law, and you worked 40 hours a week, you would earn somewhere between £20,000 and £23,000, something like that. Slightly depends, because you're not going to work 52 weeks a year, all of that. The majority of musicians in the UK earn less than half of that, which is relative poverty. So and I say that just to be real. And the other interesting piece of data to say, people talk about, yes, you can make a living as an independent musician and you can build your career as an independent musician. The median reported income in the United Kingdom for a self-releasing artist is £12,944 a year. It's £13,000. It's £1,000 a month. The reason I say that is to say, if you look around and think that loads and loads of people are earning a really good living being a musician, that's just demonstrably not true. And that if you are earning a good living from a musician, you're doing incredibly well. I mean, whenever I meet musicians that live entirely off their music and live a decent enough standard of living, it's profoundly impressive. And it's worth remembering actually how incredibly unusual it is for a musician to earn more than the minimum wage in the United Kingdom. Very unusual.
I think I mentioned, we were chatting just before we started recording, but I mentioned to you about, for me, when I signed a major deal like that, changed my life in terms of I was able to do music full time, and and meant even after I left that record label, I was still able to do music full time because of signing that deal. And I think for a lot of artists that come from, like myself, a working class background where you don't have that instant access to the music industry, or you don't have that safety net in a sense, and that's sort of now like what you're saying, those statistics is I've always known that, I've always thought that, but when you put it so plainly in those statistics, it really does sharpen it really does put it right into focus. And I think that, like, as well, especially now, we do sort of see a bit of a split within the industry where some artists physically cannot afford to keep going and doing these gigs where they're getting paid £50 or less. Like there was some young artists I was talking to earlier this year, and they were getting offered £20, £30 to do a support slot, and it's just absolutely wild.
And what's so wild about that is that continues to be reflected further and further up. So you may have seen this discussion last year with Nadine Shah. I mean, Nadine Shah is a class act, right? I mean, you look at Nadine Shah's career, and it's she's an incredibly impressive singer-songwriter. And last year on Twitter, I think before Twitter went completely mad and everyone left it, she was having a conversation where she was talking about, I can't afford to play at Glastonbury. And lots of people in the comments were putting underneath what do you mean? Like, you're Nadine Shah. What do you mean you can't afford to play at Glastonbury? She's like, well, Glastonbury will cost me money. You won't get paid for doing Glastonbury. The idea is that you do Glastonbury because hopefully you're going to appear on BBC iPlayer, and that's going to do something for your career that will then earn you that money back. Any other career or any other form of work you would look at, you would think, what is going on? Like, what is the economy of this life? How does this make any sense? But people don't know. People don't know the reality of what this looks like. For the vast majority of people, there is a tiny, tiny fraction of people who earn very good livings from music. Don't get me wrong, there are people that do it. The vast, vast majority are really struggling to piece together financially a life of what this looks like. And I say this not to be off-putting. Like, I genuinely say this to be like, knowing that should be a liberating thing in a way, because you need to acknowledge that actually the reality on the ground for most of these people is not what you imagine that it is. People are really struggling to turn this into something. So, we can talk more about this, but this has, one of the most interesting conversations that I have with young people or students or other people that I talk to about the relationship between mental health and well-being and a musical career. And it's something that everybody can do, is to have a conversation with yourself and others about what does success mean to you. It's a hugely important question. And it's a question that's also very much worth having, which is another kind of tip, actually, in a way. These are really important questions to have with people that don't work in music and ideally don't work in the arts. Like, have it with people that work in music as well, but have it with someone who does, is a teacher, or have it with someone who works in a normal labor market, about, as you're growing up, as you move from 18 to 22 to 28 to 30, whatever, what do you want from your life? What are the things that you think are important? And I mean that in like a really being honest with yourself conversation about what matters to you without judging yourself about what matters to you. And I had to have this conversation, right? Like, I was signed to Sony. I signed to a subsidiary deal of Atlantic. I had tens of thousands of pounds put into my bank account. I had, I was like, wow, I'm doing it, right? I'm really, really doing it. And I had conversations with my girlfriend at the time, who'd been together who's now my wife. And we were talking about, like, what do we want from our life? I want a nice car. I don't care if that makes me shallow. Like, I want a BMW. I don't want to drive this old car. I want to buy a flat, and I want to buy a flat in a bougie part of London. Again, I don't care if that makes me shallow. That's what I want. And we want to have children. We want to have a family. We've been together for 20 years. Like, I want to, I've been with her since we were 15. Well, I want to have children. Like, is music moving me further towards the things I want from my life? Or is it actually keeping me further away? And for me, it was moving me further away, because that's what I wanted. What is it that you want from your life? And is music helping you get there? Because if it is, keep going, and let's figure out a way to make it keep going. But for some people, it isn't. But having a really open conversation about what success is for you, I think is a really fantastic exercise in, like, clarifying your values and the things that you think are important. Because it's hard to work out what success means when there's such an incredible disjuncture between reality and mythology.
I really get that, and I really resonate with it, and I really like it as well. And apologies, I butted in and took us on a little tangent there, but you were going to go into saying, when I'd asked about in terms of the research, what are the record labels saying, what's the industry saying, like, what is their opinions, what's their views on what artists feel like, basically.
Yeah. That was a large tangent, but it was an interesting tangent. Okay, cool. So yes, in terms of what the majors think, right? So one of the things that you can see is that clearly in the last 10 years, the major labels in the UK have started taking this conversation around mental health and well-being much more seriously. I mean, broadly because, like, the statistics are undeniable. So there's like an injunction on them in a way to take it seriously. Now, I don't know any of the people that run the mental health and well-being stuff within labels. I have no kind of stake in the game, like, in that way. I can only tell you, what's currently out there. Within the three majors, for example, in the UK, Sony has a head of artist well-being. And I know that they offer kind of in-house therapy and stuff to musicians and workers and stuff that work with Sony. Universal Music Group have the same. They have a kind of in-house therapy that they offer for people. And my understanding is that as part of artist contracts that they sign to, they can have a certain number of sessions. I haven't seen their contracts, so I don't know, but that's my understanding. And Warner Music Group have the same, except they buy in their services from a third party, which strikes me as very sensible, actually, because there's less conversations around conflicts of interest. So they clearly, I mean, you couldn't accuse them of doing nothing. I mean, that would be an unfair characterization. They are demonstrably doing something. One of the things I think that's like less clear, because we don't have any data on it, I guess, is kind of how quote unquote well much of this stuff is working. So, you know, for whom and under what circumstances these things are working well. And I guess in a way it depends on kind of how cynical you want to be. I mean, there's a cynical end of the scale that says, well, you know, this is good for corporate social responsibility and makes people look good, and it's kind of well-being washing because, you know, we'll offer 6 therapy sessions, but ultimately the working conditions are still horrific and blah blah. Or a more optimistic end of the scale would be to say, well, this is very much a meaningful step in the right direction. You saw after the Chapel Roan speech at the Grammys, there was a partnership between Universal Music Group and Backline in the United States where they rolled out various things. The conversation compared to 10 years ago is night and day, right? So there are clearly things that are happening. And the other thing as well is to say, and I don't know how many like musicians and people that work in music know about the musicians' mental health like intervention landscape. Like I know about it because I work in it every day, but I don't know how well like your average rapper in Glasgow, for example, knows about all of this stuff. But there are lots of organizations in the United Kingdom that are dedicated to the mental health, improving the mental health and well-being of musicians and music industry workers, many of them emanating in the charity sector. And for example, if you go on a website like the Musicians Union, that's quite a good, let's call it kind of neutral barometer space. If you go on the Musicians Union website, you will find a list of all of the organizations in the UK that that offer support. And much of that support as well is subsidized. So if you call and you say, look, I earn whatever, £6,000 a year making music, I can't afford to pay a therapist £100 an hour, they will pay for it for you. Many of them will. Or there will be other forms of support too. So, you know, the optimist in me says this is seriously improving and things are moving in the right direction. The cynicist in me says, the cynical person in me, I don't know if cynicist is even a word, the cynical person in me says there's a huge amount that still needs to change in terms of the working conditions and how musicians understand their lives and careers and things like that, because the data shows you that this is still profoundly a place full of profound struggle. It just demonstrably is. But things are happening, like they clearly are.
And no, that's really good to hear. And I think it's sometimes when, even as an artist, if you're working with a label or you're well within the industry, you sometimes don't really know what's going on the other side, or you don't know what that sort of perspective is. And I know for a lot of young artists, it does very much feel like you're really on the outside looking in to this, I don't know, melting pot of the industry, and you're like, how do I get into that? I don't know how to get into it. And then you're in it, and then you don't know what on earth is going on. But it is really good to hear that there are steps being taken, like you say, by the majors in that way, and that is good to know. And like what you were saying, I don't know as well yet how much people do know about the resources that are out there, and we know that from your research that you've done has led to helped launch Music Minds Matter, which is a brilliant tool. This is a brilliant platform as well. So for anyone that doesn't know, Music Minds Matter is predominantly a 24/7 mental health free support line for musicians. It launched in 2017, so it has been going a while now, but I remember at the time it was so welcomed, and it felt like just like a big sigh of relief. It was like, there's this, I can't believe this hasn't existed before now. And yeah, really just super important. Something to note as well, the service is not just for musicians, it's for the industry on or off stage. So yeah, you can have the free support line. As George was saying, you can also receive free counselling sessions as well. And also on the website, if you check that out, Music Minds Matter, there's other stuff they've got going on. I was having a look as well, and they've got free online self-care sessions called Check Your Levels, about all host of different topics and things within the industry that sounded really good as well.
Yeah, it was incredible when that came through, because yeah, I remember the research that led to the launch of that charity by Help Musicians. Yeah, it was called Can Music Make You Sick, which was Sally Ann Gross and myself did. And then in 2016, when we were interviewing people, in 2017, when we were interviewing people about this topic, you could feel people in these interviews being like, wow, someone's really asking me about this, because in 2015 no one had a conversation like this, right? Like this was not something that was being discussed, and you could feel people wanting to share their stories about what it felt like to live and work in this space, like the good and the bad. But I mean, obviously we were kind of focusing on the bad because so often the story is the good. The good is easy to tell. Everyone loves telling a good story. Um, so yes, yeah, it was. We were thrilled when that announced, and now that organization, because now it's a standalone charity, sits within a kind of range of other services that exist in the UK. Like I say, you can see a list of them on the Musicians Union or other places like that, and it's really. It is really wonderful to see like all of these organizations exist, and it's like I'm not a clinician, like I'm not a psychologist, so to me, in a way, like the job that they do is way harder than the job that I do, because it's like I collect the data, I publish the data. In a way, sometimes I joke and say, well, I can be like Nero saying that Rome is on fire, but it's not my job to put the fire out. But there are people whose job it is to try and help put the fire out. So it's really impressive stuff.
Yeah, and I think we were mentioning earlier about how difficult it can be to open up and have those conversations, but knowing that this is a music specific thing is really helpful, because there's a lot of times I know personally, but also a lot of other artists, where you would want to seek help or reassurance or want some guidance, but because there's the music industry and it's meant to, as we say, it's meant to all be great, or you don't want to be seen moaning about it, or you don't think people are gonna understand. I guess that's the biggest thing when you feel like when you're in the trenches sometimes of dealing with stuff, or specific experiences might have brought it on, or there just might be an underlying way of how you feel. And I think a lot of times we can feel like, but nobody's gonna understand me, nobody's gonna get why I feel like this, they're going to think I'm silly, they're going to think I'm ungrateful and all of that stuff. And it's really brilliant that there is this music specific, because it takes away that initial talking point. You already know you're in the music industry, you already know that's pretty much the reasoning.
Yeah, you don't need to like contextualize your experience for somebody to understand it. Because when you interview, I mean, I've interviewed like a lot of musicians like in the last 10 years, but when you ask them specifically, for example, about their experiences with accessing forms of like mental health and well-being care and support, you will always hear, which you hear with all kinds of populations and different kinds of research populations, is that like they want to speak to somebody who understands what their life is like, because they'll go and see their GP, for example, for anxiety, and they will talk about whatever it is that's making them anxious in the context of their career. And the GP will say something like, well, why don't you just like delete TikTok from your phone? Right? Like it's clearly making, why don't you just, and you're like, I can't do this, right? For whatever reason, I feel tethered to this thing. That's not something I can do. You don't get it. And all populations, like for whatever, and by that I mean like different kinds of research populations, they want to speak with people that like understand their lived experience and their life. And that doesn't matter whether you're doing research amongst, anybody that's going through something difficult wants to speak to somebody that understands the life that they're living. Of course they do. And the same is true of musicians. So yeah, these services are all kind of, I think, begin from that premise. So that's my understanding of it anyway. Like I say, I'm not a clinician, but that's my understanding.
No, totally. And I was going to ask as well, what I feel you've already definitely shared a lot anyway, but if there are any tips that you'd have for our up and coming musicians to help proactively manage their mental health, as we're discussing in an industry that does have so many challenges, what are your sort of, I guess, top tips?
Yeah. So I just always like to praise these, because I think because of the work that I do and like where I publish it and where I speak and things like this, I think sometimes people might think like I'm a psychologist or that I'm a clinician or that I work like clinically with people. I absolutely don't. So like, don't take what I say as like clinical advice. I offer this only in the guise of like, I've been researching this for the last 15 years, and this is the stuff that I see and hear a lot. The things that I have seen that comes through, which strike me as being helpful, and things that I talk to my students about, are, number one, have conversations at regular intervals throughout your life and your career with people that you trust and whose opinion you value about what success means in your life. It's a profoundly important thing to do, and you need to do it from a space of not judging yourself about whether or not the thing that you want feels silly. Like, have a really open and honest conversation about what success means to you and whether music is helping you to achieve those forms of success. That's the first thing. The second thing I would say is have friends who don't work in music. The people that I have come across where all of their social support group and all of their friends and peers all work in music, often what happens within those groups is there is a normalization where many of the things that take place in music, which, as Katie will attest to and as others will attest to, are frankly unacceptable. And the unacceptable things that take place sometimes get normalized because everybody forgets that actually they're working in somewhere that is quite wild. But having regular conversations with people that work in normal labor markets often is incredibly important and a useful thing to do. Those are two things I would say. And the third thing that I would say is to try and remind yourself as often as possible how curated, the kind of curated authenticity what you see online is when you're looking at other musicians online and the things that they're doing and achieving. Try and understand that many of the things that you see are masking a deeper reality of the way that those musicians too are very likely going through struggles and difficulties at the same time, regardless of what it says on their Instagram and regardless of all the smiling faces you see on TikTok and regardless of every photo you see from a swimming pool on the roof of Soho House, right? Like that's not the reality of most people's day to day. And you're comparing your behind the scenes footage to somebody else's highlight reel, and it's ludicrous. So I mean, this is true for musicians and non-musicians too, that third one. But the thing with musicians is like their achievements are kind of understood as being public. So they'll do things like you'll judge the success of your career and how successful it is by how many likes you get on this Instagram post, or, oh, when I go onto my Spotify, the number of monthly streams is public, and now people can see that I'm not as successful as somebody else. And there's this hierarchical ranking that people do and whatever. But that again comes back to that question around what success means to you. So for me, those would be the three things that I would say. Conversations around what success means to you, having friends that don't work in music, and understanding that a lot of what you see online is a myth. To me, those three things are at least a fairly good starting point, because you're not going to change the reality on the ground for most musicians, which is that their incomes are terrible and the working conditions are extremely challenging. Like, maybe you can change that, but like you as a listener listening to this, or a young person trying to be a rapper or a producer or starting a band, you're not going to change the working conditions in King's Cross. Like, that's not going to happen. But those things you can change. And I would also add a fourth thing as well, actually, to this list. And the fourth thing is to and I've heard this in interviews a lot in the last 10 years, is to focus on the things that you can control. There are lots and lots of things in music that you cannot control. You cannot control the algorithm. You cannot control what somebody thinks of you. In many ways, you cannot control like the amount of money that's going to come in. Like, these things are all frightening. But there are things that you can control, right? Over like the music that you're making and the things that you're sharing and the kinds of things that you put online and the amount of time that you spend focusing on A, B, or C. There's a huge amount about a music career that you are not in control of, despite the fact that every panel you attend and every workshop you get invited to and every, well-meaning young person's music event will tell you that you are in control. That's the most popular thing that young musicians are told. You are more in control than ever, and it's not true. There's huge amounts of the music industry that you are not in control of. So focus on the things you are in control of, because otherwise it will disorientate you. So those are the four things I would say.
Totally. No, I really resonate with all that, and I get that as well. And I was just thinking about there, when we're talking about things that you can control, and I'd written down earlier when we were talking, there's diversify, and I was thinking of like, for a lot of musicians, as you say, if you're just solely relying on the income of your music making or music releasing, then it can be really, really hard. But there's so many skills now that in particular independent artists, but all artists really have gained, whether that be through recording, producing themselves at home to make demos because it's cheaper, because you can't get into the studio, filming TikTok videos, and you're getting really good at editing videos now, so now you edit your music videos. There's lots of different skills, I guess, that you'd maybe pick up along the way, and it's about using them to your advantage as well, and thinking, no, I'm now really good at editing TikTok videos, so I'm going to see who wants their TikTok TikTok videos edited. I've got really good at recording. I'm going to see, do any of my friends or any of my friends' friends want recording, and trying to find those other little income streams as well. For myself, I kind of got a lot more into the music practitioner, the teacher side of things, and I really love that, and going into schools, but that's not what works for everyone. But it's about these skills that we've learned, or the things that we've developed through being musicians or through being in the industry. It's like then using that to your advantage and going, okay, like what you say, what do I want to achieve and how am I going to get there? So if I can add these strings I've already got to my bow, then how can I make the most out of that?
I think that's a really good one. And it also, it speaks to the fact that, again, the musicians' income statistics are, intense in a lot of ways to read, but they're also, I don't know if comforting is the right word, because that's probably overplaying it, but they speak to the fact that very, very few people, a very small number of people, will earn more than minimum wage from just releasing their music alone. And that has always been true, right? That is, it has never been the case that a huge number of people, even the majority of people, could earn a sustainable living from making and releasing music. A tiny number of people do. So once you accept that, yes, you might want to shoot to be that small percentage of people and shoot for it, like go for it. Like, I get what it means to dream that dream and to go for it. But acknowledge along the way that, you're wanting to be the fastest runner in the world. You're wanting to be the person that can do the longest long jump in the world. You're wanting to be the person that can swim the fastest. You want to be Michael Phelps, Usain Bolt. These are the most elite people in the world. And that's what you're shooting for, to be a musician, to earn a high amount of living from being a musician. Now, if you're a young kid that wants to be a footballer and you want to be David Beckham, of course you should go for it, or whoever I don't watch football, but whatever, of course you should go for it. But on balance, the probability that you'll actually earn a salary like David Beckham is profoundly low. So of course you should still go for it, but you need to acknowledge that you earn a huge number of skills, as you have just said, through being a musician, that you can seek to build. Like, I am an example of this. Like, a lot of the classes that I teach come from the fact that I spent 10 years in this game, getting myself placed on Radio 1 and 1 Extra myself, performing at Reading Leeds Wireless, being on the BBC Sound Of list with Charlie XCX and Lana Del Rey. I did that. So all of those things give me a space to talk about things that other people don't have the ability to do. Now, music didn't pay my bills. Music didn't buy me a flat. Music didn't whatever. And at the time, yes, that hurt. But that's life, that is life. But music gives you a huge amount, and you're right to think about what are the ways that I can diversify this so that I can, this is the important bit, so that you can keep doing the thing that you love. Like, something brought you to doing music, that was the joy and the expression and the this and that you love doing. You didn't come to music to have the most amount of streams on Spotify per month. You didn't come to music to have the most likes on a TikTok video. You didn't come to music to have the most amount of, comments on an Instagram post. That's not why you came here. You came here for something else. So if there's a way of you keeping the thing that brought you here in the first place for the joy of it, do it. But equally, there are some individuals, like, I lost the joy of doing it. For me personally, it was no longer a source of joy for me. And that's okay. That's also okay,
Yep, definitely. I was watching, there was an interview with Lewis Capaldi recently that he was doing, and if there was a few other artists that I've seen talking about as well, Ed Sheeran actually, on the Lay Through podcast, and they're talking about how much when they're releasing music and how much it takes the joy out of it and it's not fun anymore and all of that stuff. And I'm thinking, oh, we've got these feelings too, and we're up and coming or emerging musicians, but these big music stars and people who are really, really successful in the music industry still have those same feelings. I think it definitely normalizes it a little bit. And yeah, the highs and lows of it all are still up there when you're at the top of your game as well, which I think is good to know. But what other changes would you like to see within the industry? Is there any goals or something you would like the industry to get to a point where you're like, yes, that's better, that's good?
Yeah. I mean, I think Katie will probably have even more well, I know for a fact that Katie will have much more to speak about in relation to this specific point. But one of the things, for example, that we haven't talked about, but of course Katie will share much more about, are about like what forms of regulation, for example, within this sector are like not working well. So here we're talking about, we've been talking about up and coming artists and earning money and this, that, and the other, but there are whole broader sets of questions around the working conditions in this space. So for example, if you look at, let's return to the statistic, for example, that it's a really shocking statistic that I started this conversation with, which is why is the rate of suicide among women that work in creative occupations 69% higher than the rate amongst women that are in the general population? I mean, that is a shocking statistic. And part of that, I would suggest, and there's some data that I'm about to publish in the next few months that will speak to this, is that the levels of sexual harassment and sexual violence in the music industry are very high. And it's been referred to as this thing called a conducive context, which means that the nature of the working environment in the music industry, the word facilitates is too strong, but certainly normalizes many abuses of power, rooted in the fact that you have very, very young musicians that are coming into a sector with significantly older people with huge amounts of imbalances of power, that's heavily reliant on networks and friendships and favors, where there's a very limited amount of regulatory oversight. Now that is a regulatory broad scale thing that needs to change. And frankly, no amount of having a conversation around what success means to you and, having a conversation with A, B, and C is going to change abuses of power happening by men in senior positions in the music industry. That's got to change. And so there are organizations that are doing things now, whether that's OWL with Katie or, the recently launched Creative Industries Independent Standards Authority or whatever, who are at the beginning of trying to make large-scale systemic change to make this industry safer for young women and others to work in, because it's not right. Like it's just not on. So there is so much actually that needs to change that it would be near impossible to distill it down into the conversation we're having. But there are things that you can do as an individual, which we've talked about. But what's also really important is to acknowledge, and this is what sociology of work, which is what I do, tries to do, is you cannot individualize what is a collective social and political problem, which is the nature of working in the music industry and the kind of relatively unregulated nature of music careers. You're not going to change that on your own. So the only thing that changes that is people working together in communities and organizing amongst themselves to drive change, like what Katie's doing, like what Creative Industry Standards Authority are doing, like what others are doing. That is going to drive systemic change, because for all of the talk of musicians needing to be quote unquote resilient to things that are happening in their lives and careers, I get that. I get the rhetoric around needing people to be resilient, but there are some things that we shouldn't be resilient to, we should be resistant to. Now, perhaps that's an oversimplified dichotomy to say you're either being resilient or resistant, but much of being resilient means ameliorating yourself to the reality that you're facing. Some things you should resist, and that only takes place collectively and by organizing together and being in communities and lobbying for change and all of that sort of stuff. This is a way bigger question around the political economy of the music industry. And most people want, I can do this thing on my own and this is a self-help thing that I can do. And that's great. That's all important. But there are big structural things that need to change in the music industry.
No, I totally appreciate that. And I think, we could probably, talk for days about all of it and go into it, but we're gonna wrap things up there. But there's something that we're gonna ask all of our guests, and it does lead on from what we've just spoken about, and I know it's hard to define it into one thing, but anyway, we're gonna ask all of our guests if you could make one tiny change following on from this conversation, whether that be for young people or for the industry, what would that be?
My one would be people being more honest about music careers. Everybody loves talking about the good, and I get why they love talking about the good. And sometimes it's kind of, I'm jokingly referred to as like the depressing guy that's sitting on a panel, or like the depressing guy like at a music event. But to be honest, I don't really care anymore. For me, a small change that people could make is more regularly sharing the losses or the kinds of behind the scenes reality. That's why I think what Nadine Shah did with sharing what happened at Glastonbury was so powerful, where she said, I can't afford to play at Glastonbury. And I've seen bands that have shared their receipts, for example, from the end of their tour, where you've seen we've just been on a tour around Europe and we all lost money. That's real. That's really real. And I think, being real matters. That would be what I would say. Being real.
Thanks so much, George, for all your amazing insight. And you've also hinted to our other part of this episode. We are chatting with the fabulous Katie Waisel. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you very, very much. We'd love to know, what do you think the music industry needs to change most urgently? You can join the conversation on our socials. It would be great to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep making tiny changes that lead to something big.
If you've been affected by anything that came up in today's episode, you can find a list of resources for reaching out for help in the episode show notes, or you can check out Tiny Changes support page at tinychanges.com/support. Thank you to our great host, B. Charlotte. Music produced by the brilliant Barry Jackson. Podcast artwork by the amazing Berwin Muir. Technical production by the very talented Ross Sloan. This podcast was created and produced by Kayla Megan Burns and Nina Abisoria for a Tiny Changes pilot production.